Could you just explain what oral history is?
So it's basically like an interview where you're getting somebody's testimony, right? You're getting somebody's experience about a particular topic. We're living in a historic moment, and politics has shifted dramatically because of this moment. What you're doing through this oral history, when you sit down and interview somebody who's been involved in these events, is you're documenting their story. And when historians and when scholars and journalists write about this moment that really is shifting the conversation, that's changing history, you're going to be a part of that conversation. So that's pretty cool. The idea for this is you're going to be conducting an oral history with somebody in your social network. So somebody you're familiar with. When you interview them, you are allowed to be familiar with them. You don't have to worry about sounding super formal. You want to be comfortable. You want them to be comfortable. So it's important that you interview somebody that you know, probably, right? A friend from school, a family member. Ideally, your interview will be at least 15 minutes. It's going to be a little more difficult right now just because of COVID. Most of you are going to be doing these interviews over the phone. But after we get through this, I believe that all of you can probably achieve that 15-minute mark. You are the architect of this interview. If you are uncomfortable asking a question, don't ask that question, right? If you find that your interviewee is uncomfortable answering a question, don't pursue it. It's okay, right? We want to get stories that people are comfortable with. We don't want to make anybody uncomfortable here.
So this is technically an interview, not an interrogation. You're not doing a police interrogation.
If your interviewee is more comfortable conducting the interview in Spanish, then conduct it in Spanish. We want the best stories out of this person. So if it's another language, that's cool. I only speak Spanish. I don't speak some other language that maybe are spoken in your household, but that's fine. Whatever language they are most comfortable in, that's the language that the interview should be done in.
Again, this is going to be part of a collection that we're starting at Gutman. You can click on this link right here, and it'll sort of show you what we've created so far, which is very small. But right now, we have a massive grant to expand this to about 100 oral histories. And so you're going to be a part of a really cool collection that documents the experiences of the community surrounding the college in historic times. All right, so now you see online, this is the Gutman Oral History Collection. We could click and listen to interviews.
Okay, Sylvia, how old are you?
You're going to be a part of this collection that we're building. And then when you click also, you could read a transcript. This makes it accessible to everybody. This is where your oral history will be stored. Your interview will be stored. And this collection is going to expand massively, like I said, in the next few months. All right, so before the interview, make sure that you figure out how you're going to record the interview. If this is just on your phone and this is a family member who lives in your household, COVID makes things complicated. There are apps on both iPhones and Androids that allow you to record very easily. If it's over the phone that you're going to be doing this interview, what most people have done is either take two phones and do the interview on speaker and record it on the second phone, or there are many apps that you could download. Some of them cost a few dollars. I don't want you guys to spend any money on this. If you can find a free app that allows you to record calls, you can do that as well. You could also set up the interview as a Zoom call and record the Zoom call like I'm doing right now. That's another way to do this. And then that's actually cooler in some ways because we get the visuals.
21st century.
25, I know, it's a crazy new world out there, Gary. It's important that you practice recording. You want to make sure whatever strategy you use works, right? And while the interview is going on, you want to make sure that it's actually recording. You don't want to waste your time having done it and then telling somebody, thank you for sharing all your deepest, darkest secrets with me. We have to do it again because I messed up the recording. That's not what you want to happen, you know?
We're now going to talk to Natalie Saldariga, who is an expert in oral history, and she's going to give us some additional tips in terms of recording your oral histories. One of the things that Natalie, you suggested was make sure that the interviewee fully understands the project and why you're interviewing them. Why would you say that's important?
So it's easy to forget that this project or whatever project you're working on is kind of been your focus for maybe a few weeks, a few months, but this person is just learning about this. So as maybe you don't want to admit, maybe it's not as important to them as it is to you, but it's not important to them if you don't explain it to them in the correct way, and why their participation is so vital and why you're reaching out to them specifically. And also, your project usually has an end goal. So if you are explaining your end goal to the interviewee, it'll be easier to reach that goal.
So another point that Natalie brought up was giving the questions to the interviewee beforehand. Why might this be useful? Don't we want to like surprise them? Why is it why is it maybe not as effective to surprise them with questions?
Yeah, so that's what I thought before I had my experience. You want the interviewee to know what they're getting into, and you don't want it to be scripted. You don't want them to write out responses and like read them, but you want them to kind of think about what they want to say and how they want to say it. In any situation, it's always better to be a bit prepared rather than to just kind of improvise. It won't be as good as, or the work won't be as good if you're not prepared. So the same thing for your interviewee. You don't want to catch them off guard. Maybe there's a question they don't want to answer, but since they didn't see the list, then in the middle of your interview, you have to figure out what to do. You don't want to offend anyone. You kind of want the interview to flow. So that's why I think it's really important to make sure that they do look at the questions beforehand. Always remind them, you don't have to plan out your answer, but kind of get, the thoughts going in your head, because then they'll be happier as well with the interview they gave.
Yeah, and like when have you ever had a conversation and like you're like, oh, or an argument, and you're like, I wish I had said that, right? But if you had the list of questions beforehand, you probably would have said it. And so it gives them time to prepare and give you the best stories, right? Yeah. And you also talk about the transcription process. All of you are going to have to produce a transcript. Get excited. It is not the most fun part of the work, but it is really important. And you talk about taking notes when you're transcribing. I know when I first started transcribing, it takes a while. So you want to get through it. Why is it important to take this extra step and take notes?
What's going to help you in the long run? Of course, you're not going to do the interview and then like lock it up in, like a safe, and no one ever is going to watch it. You're going to want to share it with the world, and you're going to want to promote your interview. And there's always a gem, at least one little gem in your interview that you're going to want to go back and use it so that you can promote it. But if you've been transcribing for hours, you're going to forget where that little gem was. So if you make a note of it, it's just going to make your life so much easier after you're done with the transcription.
Yeah.
We really need them to know what they're getting into, right? They need to know this isn't just a conversation that is going to be shared between 30 people in a classroom or me and Professor Graves. This is a conversation that is going to inform future generations about what was going on. And if they're not comfortable with that, then they shouldn't be interviewed, right?
Yeah, this is going to be archived so that somebody 50 years from now or 100 years from now
or tomorrow.
will be able to, or tomorrow.
During the interview, as soon as the interview starts and as soon as you start recording, make sure that they know that you're recording the call. You tell them over the recording, by the way, I'm recording this call. You're cool with that. And then at the beginning of the conversation, I want you to go over the consent form.
A reminder that we have two versions of the consent forms, one in English and one in Spanish. If you're doing the interview in a language that's not one of these two, or if the person you're interviewing is more comfortable in a different language, I'm going to ask that you translate the consent form into that language just verbally.
During the interview, it's important not to be judgmental of their responses. If they say something that you don't agree with necessarily, you don't be like, what did you say? I can't believe that. Because what's going to happen if they do that, Gary?
Interview's over.
The interview's over. They're going to shut down, right? And
there's going to be an argument.
It's just, that's not what we're looking for here. We want their truth, right?
Yeah.
If they're talking about an experience with police officers and you have very strong opinions about police officers, you don't have to announce to them, these are my really strong opinions about police officers, because then they're going to start telling the story in a way to make sure that you're happy. And be casual. You know this person, right? You don't have to be stiff. You don't have to, be very formal, use words that you never used before. Talk to them like you normally talk to them. If you curse, It is not a big deal. That's a way to get people to open up. You want them to be able to give the fullest version of their truth. During the interview, give cues that you're listening, that you're not just, tuning out, right? Especially if this is over the phone, you got to tell people that you're still interested. Little sounds over the phone like or sure, or things like that give the indication that you're listening. That's helpful. Another thing that's really useful is if you have good follow-up questions. If you're asking them about what they're saying, then they know that you're listening. If you're asking them about random things that they're not saying, then they think you're not listening, right? So it's important to ask follow-up questions based on what they're saying. So when they're talking, you should be taking notes, right? You should be thinking, all right, well, that's interesting. How can I build on that? What more do I need from that? It sounds like there's a story there. If I only ask one more question, how do I get that story?
So when somebody has finished saying something or explaining something, and you see, and they might have touched on something maybe interesting or kind of interesting, it's okay to maybe follow up with that particular question or that particular comment or that particular area that they were just talking about.
It's super important. It's like, it's the heart of the interview, right? You really, really, really want people to know that you're listening, and you want to build on what they're saying. Because if it's just an assortment of random questions that were predetermined beforehand, that's not useful for anybody, right? You're trying to get the best stories out of them. And the way that you do that is you're an active listener. You listen to what they say. Oh my gosh, that's really interesting. I need to follow up with that. Doesn't mean you interrupt them, right? You don't interrupt them. That's why you write it down right next to you. But you listen to what they're saying, and from what they're saying, you're coming up with new questions, new avenues to sort of question them on.
It's okay to go off on a tangent.
If the tangent is totally irrelevant to what you're trying to get at, if they start talking about their favorite ice cream flavors, let them talk, whatever, and then you redirect it back to what are we talking about, right? But if they're saying, and like, I've had a history of bad encounters with the cops, and then they go on talking and talking, you go back to, could you talk to me a little bit about that history of bad encounters with the cops? I'd like some more details there. I really want to understand it. It's important to get out all the information that we're trying to get out of these questions, but you could change any of these questions. The only thing you have to not change, and has to be exactly the same, is this first thing. My name is Samuel Feinsary, and today I am interviewing Gary Graves in the computer. I'm in New Jersey. He's in his home in
Brooklyn, New York, the center of the universe.
I've heard of it. Today's date is Sunday, July 5th, 2020.
Professor Graves, do you give me permission to record and distribute this oral history?
And this information is useful. If anybody's uncomfortable giving any of this information, they don't have to, all right? The point is that when people in 200 years are trying to document this history, it's nice for them to sort of have some qualifiers to understand whom we're talking about. It's not necessary, though. The story is what's important. All right? You could ask where they're from, right? Tell me a long story of how you or your family ended up in New York City, right? For a lot of people, certainly in our community at Gutman, it's lots of immigrant stories, right? That's an interesting conversation. Some people have come from other parts of the country. That's going to change their perception of racism. If they're coming from the U.S. South, there's a different version of racism in the U.S. South. They're coming from the DR, there are different versions of racism in those places. There are different relationships between police officers and civilians in those places. We need to sort of understand where they're coming from and how they ended up in New York. All right?